welcome to Dialogue. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is currently on a three-day visit to the U.S. The landmark visit is seen as the latest step towards advancing high-level communication between the two countries, following a series of exchanges by senior officials. So what are the main topics of discussion between the two sides? Can we still find ways to break through the chilly bilateral relations? And will the two countries be able to cooperate to stabilize the relations between them as well as in other parts of the world? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined today by Professor Zha Daojun from Peking University, Dr. Zhao Hai, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Klaus Lauris, the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. That's our topic. I'm Xu Jinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. Professor Zha, I will start with you. So Wang Yi is in the United States. This is happening after a series of exchanges. We see, China visit by the U.S. Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, and of course, Secretary of Treasury, of Secretary of Commerce, etc. So right now, there's a senior Chinese official in Washington. Where are we now? What's the purpose of this visit?
Well, to be frank and honest, the issues between the two countries are so multifaceted, and the difficulty of changing the overall narrative in both political capitals are so challenging that I'm not trying to be just skeptical for the sake of it. I would think even if you have crisscrossing visits of this caliber, day in and day out, we still need more meetings. But that's not to be sarcastic. I would think, like you said, months after the visits by cabinet-level Americans to China, and it's a good sign that Mr. Wang is reciprocating the visit at this point of time.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Zhao Hai, so we do see, frequent visits actually lately, including the latest one, to China by the U.S. California Governor Newsom. He has been to several Chinese cities and they well received by the Chinese side, including meetings with Vice President, Foreign Minister, and also President Xi Jinping. So, how do you characterize the current status of China-U.S. relations?
Well, currently, I think China-U.S. relations is moving towards stabilization. So in the past year, we've experienced difficulties, and the relationship is really frozen, and now it's starting to thaw and gradually moving towards a more positive side. However, at this stage, how to stabilize relationship, and especially how to move forward with a more positive agenda, that is the question during Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to the United States. And in the future, I think the key is that after last year's Bali meeting, there is a path moving forward decided by the two top leaders. However, I think both sides are not stopping at that. They need further guidance on the principles of how to deal with each other. Like Professor Zha pointed out, we need to change the environment, the narrative, and so that they can have a more overlapping, let's say, more common ground to form a positive agenda to move this relation even further. And by local, Governor Newsom's visit, that means on the local level, two sides also needs to reestablish ties with each other because of the pandemic that's been cut off. And now, with the visits, and particularly with a warm welcome from the Chinese side, China has shown that we're active in terms of developing local ties with the United States. And it also shows that Governor Newsom has the political courage to come to China despite what's happening within the DC circle, and also shows that on the local level, there are many other states that I've heard of are trying to come to China and develop more trade and people-to-people relations. I think previously, before the pandemic and before the relationship worsened, there are many ties between the two countries that support this engagement between the two countries. Now we want that to come back.
Mm-hmm. Professor Laris, from the U.S. point of view, how do you see the recent, let's say, positive development, of exchanges? At least the two sides are resuming the dialogues. Not all of them, but they are talking to each other and increasingly more frequently. How do you see that kind of development?
Yeah, relations between the United States and China are still difficult, but they're moving in the right direction. And it's important that dialogue and communication is opened up again. And this has been the problem in the recent past, that both sides were not talking to each other in fields such as trade restrictions, such as technology exchange, export controls, but also regarding geopolitical issues. There are serious crises in the world. We only have to think of that terrible war in Ukraine. Now, what is unfolding in Israel, also a terrible humanitarian disaster potentially. All this needs to be talked about, and I think opening up communication again between the two most important countries in the world is highly important. So it is moving in the right direction, but now the substantive decisions have to be taken, and Wang Yi's visit will contribute to that. He will prepare also, hopefully, the meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping in San Francisco in November, which will hopefully happen. And after that, both sides will take some tough decisions. And no side will be entirely pleased with the outcome. They have to compromise. And to open dialogue and communication is, of course, the first step to arrive at a good compromise both sides can live with and the world can live with.
Mm-hmm. Professor Laris, you mentioned about tough decisions to be made probably for both capitals. What do you refer to?
Well, for example, the geopolitical situation in Gaza and Israel. Here we would like to see, from an American point of view, we would like to see China's involvement rather than a kind of pro-Palestinian neutral position which China seems to have adopted in the last few days and weeks. We would like to see Chinese influence in Iran to prevent Iran from becoming involved directly or encouraging Hezbollah in the north of Israel, the northern border of Israel, to become involved. And I think that would be a huge progress if some sort of agreement could be arrived at between the US and China to how to overcome that terrible crisis in Israel and Gaza.
Mm-hmm. Professor Zhai, if you look at some of the U.S. expectation, of course, Washington would like to see China side with the Europeans, the U.S., in terms of a Ukraine issue, in terms of the Israel-Hamas conflicts, for example. But that's really, something beyond the direct bilateral relationship. For the Chinese side, what are the top priorities? What does China see as the key issues blocking the progress of the relationship here?
Well, there are lots of issues, but I would think when you mention Ukraine or you mention the Israel-Hamas conflict, it does seem to me China voices, or the mainstream voices out of China and those out of Europe and North America. Mind you, there are competing voices in those societies as well. If we simplify that to, let's say, the loudest voice, or most representative voice, it does seem to me there's a huge difference. Because as a matter of principle, I don't think there is that difference. That is, the violence or violence, unjustified violence, needs to be stopped. It cannot be condoned. But then the difference comes from what is justifiable, what's not justifiable. And from a Chinese perspective, I would think, I think this is not just myself, it represents a larger segment of the society. perspectives are shaped by historical experiences. I'm not talking about the ancient history. I'm talking about the history of the two direct parties involved. So since China is not directly involved, let's say, in either of those situations, we don't quite see how and why, let's say, you have criticism from some European quarters, American quarters, and say that China is not doing enough. After all, it takes two parties to come to a fight. It also takes the same parties to end a fight. And again, I would think there are some serious blockage points in the conversations. So conversations are important, but until you give each side gives legitimacy, recognize legitimacy of where the other side comes from, it will be remain to be should I say a mental block of sorts. So what I think China should do more is to continue to emphasize for Chinese representatives of government diplomacy, and to emphasize that violence is bad, and violence anywhere in the world is not to be condoned. And then on that basis, we call for, if secession of conflict right away is difficult, we call for reduction of tension and move in that way to support. But that call, say for ceasefire, for what other means of reduction, needs to have a buy-in, meaning the two direct parties needs to both agree to doing that. And we don't really see here in China, for instance, fine, you define one party as, its action being justifiable, and then on that basis, you provide the party with military assistance. We think, well, my goodness, that's sort of like adding, well, it's not sort of, it is, really adding fuel to the fire. We don't do that. But then, other than that, we don't know what we can do.
Yeah. Zhao Hai, obviously, Beijing and Washington, they don't agree with each other over Ukraine issue, over the, say, Gaza-Israel conflict here. But at least they can work with each other probably to contain that kind of, for example, to contain the spillover effects of that kind of conflicts. But when it comes to this bilateral relationship, China-U.S., people would say, oh, it worsened since 2018 when the U.S. And Trump administration imposed, for example, trade war on China, and then we see tech war, information war, whatever you say. There are all kinds of, almost like a containment efforts, over the Chinese development. So is that a big issue for China, probably to reach the U.S.? We are not competing with the U.S. in a zero-sum manner?
Yeah, I think you're right, because let's set the bilateral relationship priority right, because on the top of the agenda is China's national security and homeland security, because right now, the top agenda between the two sides, and particularly China's position towards the U.S. is that on our doorsteps, for example, the cross Taiwan Strait, South China Sea and East China Sea, and also on the Korean Peninsula, there are many flashpoints that could escalate into some kind of confrontation and even conflict. So the top priority for both countries is to manage those differences and reduce the tension and try to make sure that East Asia, West Pacific, is peace and does not follow the suit of the conflict in Europe and Middle East. So that's number one. And other than that, as you mentioned, China has complained about the tariff, and actually President Trump President Biden campaigned to actually cancel President Trump's tariff. However, he didn't accomplish that. And also on the tech war, even though the U.S. is advocating the so-called small yard high fence, however, until today, the U.S. has not provided a clear boundary or explanation where the fence is, and also what does de-risk means for the bilateral relationship. So there are many issues on the table bilaterally we need to talk about. And on the international security, of course, China and the United States can work together, try to bring peace. And China is following its global security initiative on both cases. On the Ukraine conflict, China has provided its own peace proposal, and yet so far, I think both sides, particularly on the Ukraine side, with the supply of weaponry from the United States, they try to continue to fight. And on the Israeli issue of the conflict between Israel and Hamas, China is on the side of peace as well. In the UN Security Council, there has been multiple mutual sort of declining to accept any proposal from each side, because they cannot agree on the wording how to deal with the current situation, involving, for instance, a humanitarian ceasefire and Israel's self-defense right. But I think, moving forward, this humanitarian crisis is developing into an unacceptable level, and we need to do something about it. So I think it's not the right time for the U.S. to press China to influence Iran or whatever. That's not the point. The point is that all sides needs to have an acceptable United Nations Security Council resolution to call on both sides to immediately have a ceasefire and save the people in Gaza. And the following things can have a political settlement, like releasing the hostages and try to find a peaceful solution, particularly follow the two-state solution, moving forward to make sure that in the future this kind of things does not happen again. So again, I think as Foreign Minister Wang Yi has said, China is on the right side of history, and I think in the future, history will proven that China's position is the only viable position in terms of having peace globally.
Mm-hmm. Professor Laris, I think we touched the point, say the Middle East situation there and the Ukraine, and of course, if you include in climate change, transnational border crimes, for example, there's a lot for China and the U.S. to cooperate, to work together. You can see common challenges or common interests in that direction. But at the same time, we do see there's, some people say the structural issue or geopolitical competition issue for the U.S. From the Chinese perspective, the U.S. is basically trying to slow down the Chinese innovation, the Chinese tech development. Is there any compromise we can do in that respect?
Both sides have to accept that they are rivals and will continue to be rivals and geopolitical and also trade and technology competitors. And that in the end needs to be accepted. So when there are trade restrictions on semiconductors, on high-tech semiconductors going from the United States to China are imposed, that is from an American point of view totally understandable, because why should the United States help China to develop its military? From an American and from a Western point of view, China has become an assertive, if not aggressive, power in the South China Sea. Only think of the clashes between the Philippine Navy and the Chinese Coast Guard. Also, China has said that it may take Taiwan by force. In American ears, this is terrible and should not stand. And to help China to develop its military with high-tech semiconductors to achieve these aims is counterproductive from an American point of view. And this explains why there are restrictions on high-tech technology goods going to China. But that doesn't mean that the United States doesn't want to trade with China or doesn't want to have a good economic and financial relationship with China in other areas. There are so many products both countries exchange with each other and they trade with each other, pharmaceutical goods, textiles, of course, the car industry, and so on and so on. And in all these areas, trade can flourish pretty easily. There are concerns that there are restrictions on Western companies imposed by China in the domestic Chinese market, and that needs to be talked about. And I think Wang Yi's visit to Washington will contribute to that, to resolve these issues which can be resolved. And of course, if I may say that about the geopolitical situation in the Middle East, it is of course the point for the United States and China to work together to prevent the conflict from escalating. And China can impose pressure on Iran to prevent that conflict from escalating. And from a Western point of view, it is very frustrating that China has not condemned Hamas attack attack on Israel. China has not condemned the aggressive Russian war against Ukraine. So it has not come down against the aggressor in both sides. And this is, from a Western point of view, very frustrating and cannot really be understood. And here's a lot of room for improvement, how both sides can work together and overcome very terrible, very difficult international situation together and in a constructive and peaceful way. And if I may finish with that, the United States and China can actually work together. For example, in April, the United States helped China to make sure that Chinese diplomats could escape from Sudan. The Chinese Foreign Ministry asked the United States to help, and the US State Department helped to get Chinese diplomats out of that war zone in Sudan in April. So both sides can work together if they want to work together and if they get their act together. There is room for improvement here, a lot.
Professor Zhao, you want to respond?
Well, basically, Professor Laros gave a summary of the good old saying, trading with the enemy. So that line of argument, justifying restrictions or various curbs or on the basis of national security, you may as well, any party can make that argument. So you imagine a situation that China made the same argument and start talking about relating to the United States on any of those issues. Why should China be contributing to the growth of American military power, which, like Zhao Hai said, shows up on China's doorstep every day? Because the distinction between civilian and military in technology or is really difficult to draw. That's, as simple as this. A soldier is a human. A human drinks water. Now, water that goes into a civilian person and water goes into a soldier's mouth that go to open the fire, it's the same water. So I don't really think, frankly speaking, that argument of national security or not contributing to the Chinese, the strengthening of Chinese military capacity really has, I don't know. I think it has its own persuasiveness to some in America, but you try that on a third party, or you try that on some other Chinese. Now, that goes, on the other hand, competition is a natural phenomenon, even among siblings in the same family or among the peers at a workplace. What we should really have is some more sensible boundaries, going back to the basics. In other words, for instance, when you talk about semiconductors or even AI, they don't just go to weapons. I one time had a surgery on my left eye, and my doctor told me there was semiconductors with AI that could perform better. And when you start to say, okay, these technologies are so military, but then what about the spillover effect on the rest of the society? In terms of applications to medical and many other applications. And this is whereby the reference in out of the United States, earlier Zhao Hai talked about what's in the yard, right? How high the fence. Reference to biotechnology. Biotechnology is so broad. It can be, technology used to alter genetic elements of seeds. Why you do that? Because you want to produce more climate-resistant seeds. That's better food, right? Biotechnology gets used in medicine. Certainly, people can take from there and say, well, medicine can be weaponized as well. So it's really should I say, a challenge here. I don't know how much more of these sort of arguments, what I just said, that China might as well make the same argument on the US or on anyone else. Should everyone in the world start to adopt that so-called security-driven or military-driven, I don't really think that takes conversations much of anywhere. So what we really have to differentiate here is whether or not so-called competitiveness, is actually the real factor, the real issue here, rather than national security, rather than military capacity.
Mm-hmm. Zhao Hai, coming back to the China-U.S. relationship here, as we say, people would say this is a contradiction between a rising power and an established power, meaning the United States, which would not like to see to be surpassed by a new power. People say that's a key problem in terms of the relationship between the two sides. What's your response? Is that the key issue, and how should China respond to the anxiety or concerns from Washington? Some people definitely have that kind of concern.
Well, it's interesting because in Washington there are two arguments coming out right now. Your argument is so past year because back then the U.S. still worried about China's catching up and threaten its dominance. However, now in Washington the new argument is that China's economy is peak and the United States is not declining, and therefore, if that's true, then where is the conflict? And now they have created a new narrative that somehow China's decline or the reduce of growth rates is going to make China more dangerous, because now China wanted to use this as use external problem as an excuse to blame others for its domestic problems. So no matter what China's speed or China's development is good or bad, there's always an argument from the U.S. about its national security. That's what I call a preemptive perception, because that means that the U.S. is presuming that no matter what, China is a threat. And if you examine, those arguments cannot withstand scrutinization. And if you closely examine their argument, there's no real logic linking between their policy and their policy aims. For instance, like just the case of chips, the chips that the U.S. is banning exporting to China is actually used in our cell phones, and I don't know how cell phones can be used militarily. And we all know that Russians, even though the U.S. has imposed on them sanctions for many years, and particularly severely last year, the Russians can still produce multiple advanced weaponry. So I think China also under this kind of sanctions for decades. All of China's military companies are under sanction, and that does not prevent China from achieving more modernization of its military. So going forward, I think it's very clear to make sure that these kind of policies not actually promoting American industrial policy and supporting American competitive in the market to achieve unfair advantages. And that's interesting because the U.S. is continually charging or accusing China of not having a level playing field with the U.S. companies. So I think both sides needs to talk with each other and show their complaints, their dissatisfactions of market environment, so that they can have agreement to reduce barriers on both sides and make sure that the two largest economies in the world continue to be free and open for business. And in the future, I think that will proven to be a vital factor for maintaining bilateral and multilateral peace in this world, and not having more and more conflicts like what we see today.
Well, common prosperity, or at least they do agree to talk to each other. That's I guess people would say positive going into the future. Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.